And welcome back to our ecology videos. This video is all about populations, which if you remember is a whole bunch of the same species living in a certain area. So we're going to look at the characteristics and how they grow. So first of all, you need to know how to measure populations. You can measure populations by size, density, dispersion patterns, and then that all helps you with growth. First off, what is size? Size of population is simply how many organisms are in the population. And this is actually dependent on the population you're actually going to be measuring. So sometimes you're measuring the population of a town. So remember, the population has to be a certain area. So how you measure this is in different ways. You can create a town census. Your parents have probably filled one of these out, and it basically asks how many people are in the household, so they know how many people live in the town. Or you can just do a count in the area. We'll turn back to this, how this could be actually good or bad. But if you want to know how many deer are in a forest, and you don't want to look through the entire forest, you can just take a small sample in an area and say there are 3 in this area, and say 1 square mile. So in 30 square miles, there should be 90 deer, and figure it out that way. But there are problems with these ways to measure, and we're going to continue to discuss this when we look at the next topic, which is density. And the fact that there are different densities in different areas determine or affect how you actually sample your population size. So density is just how many of that species in a certain area. So this is a map of the world, and you can see the more red they are, the more dense areas they are. And basically, it's just the number of people in that unit of area. So in the United States, on the eastern side, you will see that there are more people per unit of area than the rest of the United States, and except for the West Coast. So how does knowing this actually help you is you can figure out where certain species are found, which will become very useful. Now the next piece is going to be really important, which are dispersion patterns. Dispersion patterns, there are 3 different types. There's clumped, random, and uniform. And each population or species follows a certain dispersion pattern generally. Clumped is when you all group together, usually around a food source, or like a school of fish, you do so for protection. The uniform is evenly distributed, and this is usually when your solitary animals, or oftentimes birds, have nests that are equidistant, so they have their own space. So people also generally are in the uniform dispersion pattern. And then random are usually plants that have seeds that are scattered by wind because they just randomly fall someplace and grow, so there's no rhyme or reason. But the important piece to know about dispersion patterns is, if you think back to the sampling technique to determine population size, if you look in a clumped area or a clumped dispersion pattern and you just happen to hit a lot, like a big clump of that species, you might overestimate how many organisms are in that area, because if you find 50 in one certain area and say, well, if there's 50 everywhere, then would have tons and tons of this organism. So you have to be aware of the dispersion patterns when trying to figure out sampling techniques to determine population size. So now, all of this is important in determining how a population grows. And there are a few different growth patterns and cycles. The first growth pattern, or 2 growth patterns, are logistic and exponential. Now, exponential just continues to grow and grow and grow, and nothing actually stops it. Now, logistic, as you see in the graph, is one that actually levels off at what's known as the carrying capacity, which is the maximum population that a certain area can keep. And this is determined by what is known as limiting factors. And there are density dependent and density independent limiting factors. And density dependent limiting factors are things like disease or water or things like that, that actually they they limit the population because they're getting way, way too dense. Where density independent limiting factors are things like a hurricane or tsunamis, something that has no bearing on whether there's a dense population there, it just happens no matter what. But density dependent is usually dealing with the limiting resources. So if there's not enough food in the area, because it depends on the density of that area, that stops the growth of that population. Now, other things that affect the population growth are birth and death rate, things like that, so what type of species you are, but also you have two different cycles known as boom and bust and predator-prey. So obviously the relationships between species affect their growth cycles. So you have boom and bust, which is basically exponential growth, and then there's no more resources, so they all die out. And then they kind of grow a little more and then die out. Oftentimes, organisms that reproduce very, very quickly follow along this pattern. Then predator-prey, because this cycle, they rely on the interaction. So basically, if there's a lot of prey for the predator, the predators will increase in population size. But then they get to a point with there are, say, too many wolves, they're eating too many deer. So the deer population or prey population decreases. But then if there's not enough deer for the wolves will start dying out. And then it keeps cycling through, because when the wolves die out, then the deer come back. And then the wolves come back. So basically, the predator growth cycle follows the prey's growth cycle because they rely on each other for their population size and keeping them in check and keeping them covered for resources. Now, the last thing that actually affects the population growth are these two things known as survivorship curves and age structure. There are three types of survivorship curves, 1, 2, and 3, and basically they just explain what the likelihood of you surviving is. So type 1 is a human. We have a high likelihood of surviving until we get really old. Whereas the fish, they lay a lot of eggs, so they often don't have a very high survival rate when they're young. They'll lay, say, 1,000 eggs and only 10 survive. So they have a low survival, but once they get to a certain age, then they'll live for a while. So those will affect your population growth, because it depends on how long things live will affect how your population actually grows. And then the last thing are these things called age structures. And it's basically, at which age do you have the most amount of people? So on the left, you have a lot of young people, and therefore you're going to experience rapid growth because you have very few old people that are going to be dying soon, but you have a lot of young people that are going to be reproducing more and living longer. So therefore that's going to increase your growth. Whereas if you have equal amounts or more equal amounts throughout the ages, then you're going to have slow growth. So it's important for our population as well to know the age of each person so that we know how much we're actually going to be growing. And lately that has become super, super important. So now the importance of knowing about all populations and why we need to measure these things and how population and community changes is basically it affects how the ecosystem works and functions in this stability, because boom and bust cycle is not very stable. The predator-prey cycle, on the other hand, is stable, and the important part of all of biology is to maintain homeostasis. So therefore, if we are able to measure populations, know and predict what's going to happen in the future for populations, then maybe we can make some changes in our lives and in our as a human population and help out.